Hey, Jeff.
Hi, Sam. It's good to see you.
We are just about at the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I've been dying to hear your take on what do you make of how the conflict is playing out thus far?
I think I was in good company, or at least shared the views of a lot of analysts when this war began a year ago, that this would probably be a pretty quick conflict, that Russia would quickly move into Kiev, unseat the Zelensky regime, and kind of set up a puppet state that Russia could control. And I thought that would happen rather quickly. And happily, I was wrong about that. And Ukraine put up fantastic resistance, and later in the war even was able to retake territory that had lost at the beginning of the conflict in the first phase of the war. And in my kind of little military analytic community, there's been a lot of debate about what explains Russian underperformance relative to expectations in the beginning of the conflict. One group argues that Russia's military has kind of always been less capable than Western analysts assess, that they weren't ready for this conflict, that they weren't well equipped or trained to execute the war plan that they were given. And another school of thought is that the political and military leadership saddled Russia's military with a war plan that couldn't be executed effectively, that it was based on faulty assumptions, that the Ukrainian resistance would crumble, that the people would welcome Russia into Kiev, and of course that didn't materialize. And I think that probably both of those things are true. But there is another side to that story, which is the support that Ukraine received from the US and NATO. So it's not just Russian underperformance, it's Ukrainian overperformance. And that's an important piece of the story as well. But it's not just the resilience of Ukraine's military that's happening here. This is a kind of a whole society effort, right? With Ukrainian civilians kind of mobilizing support in a lot of different ways as part of the conflict. And I know you've been a principal researcher on this big project looking at Russian influence in the world. And I wonder if that sheds any light on this story.
Most of our attention is on when Russia's troops and tanks moved across the border. But actually, Russia's war plan, so to speak, you could argue began many, many years before. And you see this as a classic case, I think, of Russia's use of hybrid warfare tactics, where they were using civilian tools to apply pressure to the Ukrainian population years in advance to try to pave the way for that attack. And so this had been in play as early as 2014 with the invasion of Crimea. But what is striking, I think, in the mix of all of this is, as you said, like the resistance and the resilience that we've seen within the Ukrainian population. And what's striking about that, of course, is that if you rewound maybe a decade prior, I think you'd see a very different Ukraine. At that time, surveys of the population would say that a fraction of Ukrainian people would be willing to engage in civic life in their countries. And so this could be going out and participating in political protests or demonstrations, or even giving to charities or helping a stranger, just a very, very small minority of the population. But if you fast forward to about 2021, just the year prior to the invasion, you see a very different story. You see a Ukraine where 75% of Ukrainians said they had previously helped a stranger. Half of the population said they were donating to charities. Many, many more engaging in demonstrations. And so in my mind, this raised this question of, well, what provoked that profound change? And I think, some of it could be the rally around the flag. This population was reflecting on the fact that Russia had taken part of Ukraine's territory with the Crimea. You saw them supporting insurgents in the Donbass and the fighting there, and all of these other attempts to sow discord. And so I think Ukrainians were starting to say, hey, we feel under attack, we need to take action. But also, interestingly, Ukrainians also wanted to hold their own government to account. And so you see kind of more political resistance and scrutiny of the government. So I think taking together, you have a situation where it's not just the Ukrainian military that is putting up this fearsome resistance to Russia, but it is this whole of society approach where You have average Ukrainians that are helping out with humanitarian assistance and evacuation of local communities that are under attack. But you also see them acting in more sophisticated ways. They're doing supply chain management and runs of resources to support the military. They're providing important ground truth intelligence to feed into the Allies' operations. So I think all of this is really striking. I think the big question, though, in all of this, and I'd be curious to hear your sense, is like, how are Russia and China viewing the Eastern European landscape and Ukraine particularly? Are they viewing their interests as aligned or not aligned? I'm curious to hear your take.
Yeah, the Russia-China connection with regard to Ukraine, I think, is really interesting. And the recent news is that the United States at least has some inkling that China is willing to supply Russia with military equipment and weaponry for the purpose of for use in Ukraine, and that would be a big step. And so for China, it's a tough choice because it really does kind of add one more element to the competition between China and the United States and a large part of the West. From Russia's perspective, it could really use a supplier, right? The list of countries that are willing to supply military armament to Russia is pretty slim, getting slimmer. So they're flying Iranian drones all over, and so having China on their side in terms of a supplier of military equipment, I think would be a pretty big deal for Russia. So I think the Ukraine is like the crucible for this alliance, and we're going to see how tightly aligned China and Russia are as they come through this conflict. In Europe more generally, though, I mean, one takeaway from this conflict is maybe, for me, how much in just a year we've kind of completely reshaped European security. So if even if Russia were to withdraw today from Ukraine and go back to the 2014 border, or maybe even give Crimea back to Ukraine where it belongs, like still, Europe is irrevocably changed. So NATO is stronger and more united. It's larger soon if we have the accession of 2 more countries, as is planned. The connection between the United States and Europe is stronger. A number of countries in Europe have used the conflict to kind of pivot to a posture of defense spending and defense policy that puts them in a position to really be competitors to Russia going forward. So the changes in Europe, I think, are pretty dramatic, and they're all, from the perspective of Russia, very negative changes, right? That the kind of security environment for Russia has significantly worsened, not just because it's torn up a good chunk of its military in this conflict and lost a lot of military equipment and revealed itself to be weaker than everyone thought, but also because it now faces a Europe that's more united than before. And I don't know, I mean, do you think that the influence campaigns that it's been launching and mounting are going to be enough to make a dent in European public opinion when it comes to this conflict?
What I would say in terms of the broader ramifications to the region, I think one, it's a wake-up call. Yeah. That if you wait to be concerned about Russia's influence when you're in a hot conflict, you've missed the story because you see this slow and steady buildup for so long ahead of it. I think part of the battle there is reducing the risk of countries, so raising awareness to the existence of these tactics in very low profile ways. And then also increasing the vibrancy of society to push back, to be able to call, when they see Russia actually trying to disrupt and sow discord. But I'm wondering, Jeff, as you think about the future and where we go from here, I mean, okay, if we get back together a year from now, do you think we're going to be in the same status quo with Russia and Ukraine?
It's really hard to see where we go from here in terms of peace talks and an ultimate resolution. Neither party shows any indication right now of being willing to make a deal to end the conflict. And I think it's because both parties see a path forward that gives them more leverage in negotiation. So for Ukraine, we're all kind of anticipating a counteroffensive sometime before the summer. And I think Ukraine really does think that it can make territorial gains that will put it in a better position to demand a better settlement from Russia. From Russia's perspective, they clearly think that they can kind of play the long game here, that over time, they believe they can marshal enough forces to at least maintain the status quo in Ukraine. And one real possibility here for Putin is that maybe he's bargaining or betting that European support for Ukraine will erode over time, that US support will erode over time. And if Ukraine found itself without the kind of strong support that it has had up to now, then Russia would be in a much better position to demand a settlement. One thing that might happen in a year is we can reevaluate, did the coalition hold? Did the US and NATO continue to lend support to Ukraine sufficiently that they could continue to prosecute the war? And if it has held and if it shows little sign of eroding, then I think that puts Ukraine in a much better position to demand a favorable settlement. One thing that the rest of the world has to be thinking as they kind of watch what's going on in Ukraine, or maybe in particular the United States, is, what are the lessons that we can take from the last year for our policy going forward? What do you think, Sam?
Yeah, I think what transpired after Crimea and the imposition of sanctions, one of the things that we observed in the way that Russia used media to promote its preferred narratives, trying to pick off the resolve of the European Union allies with regard to the utility of the sanctions that were being imposed post-Crimea, the sense that, well, who's really benefiting from these sanctions? Well, it's not hurting Russia, but it's hurting you. And so why are you doing this just for the US? And so trying to splinter the resolve of allies. And I could imagine a similar dynamic taking place here. Like the utility of sanctions, the utility of resistance is only as strong as your weakest link. And Russia has proven very adept at trying to fray those ties. And so I think that is something that the US can't take for granted when it thinks about its future actions. I think secondly, this is not just a Ukraine-only story. Russia and other great powers, you could say, have their sights set on other countries in the region. And I think it's about how do you prioritize US resources, because you can't pay attention to everyone everywhere. And I do think that some of these disputed territories, breakaway regions where you have insurrection within sub-pockets of countries that are ripe for discontent and ripe for Russia to sweep in and say, hey, we will back your claims for greater autonomy. And oh, by the way, while you're doing that, we're the natural partner to you. I think that this could be a story that plays out elsewhere that emboldens other actors. And I think this is an area where the US should pay closer attention to. Another lesson in this is trying to get the balance right with supporting central authorities, but not making it appear that they are your proxy or your puppet. And that was kind of an interesting thing that played out in Russia's media narrative with regard to Ukraine. That was interesting to see in the lead up to the invasion. This alternating attempt to either position the authorities in Kiev as Ponzi's of the US, kind of working on their behest, as totally irresponsible brats. These attempts to just belittle and provoke questions about whether these central authorities actually were working in the best interests of their country. And so this raises some challenges for the US and how you navigate this. And then finally, I think being mindful of these multiple tools working in synergy together. The power of media, of investment, of leveraging some of these military tools as well. It's the combination of these things that becomes particularly scary. And I think that often our own instruments of power are viewed in a very siloed fashion. And so how do we think more holistically about how these tools all play together to reduce the risk that Russia's influence, is expanding in the region? I'm curious to see how this unfolds in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I hope if we meet again in a year here that we'll have peace in Ukraine, and that the parties will have been able to reach a settlement to end a war that's really had like a serious human toll. And so we should hope for peace at least.
I agree. That's a good thing to hope for.